Hello everyone, my name is Stephen J. Palacini. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be talking about the Francophone Mobility Program. So I've had some requests to show people how to do an offer of employment through the employer portal under the Francophone Mobility Program. And I may or may not go into the actual work permit process. It's relatively simple. I do have examples of how to do close specific work permits from within Canada, for example, under the Canada-Colombia Free Trade Agreement. But I will eventually show that process. For now, for today, I just want to show the process your employer has to go through. I want to talk about the eligibility requirements for the program and why this is a really suitable way for anybody who has a basic knowledge of speaking and listening in French to consider this to extend their work permit or get arranged employment in Canada, get an extra 50 points, or potentially to come from overseas and start working in a Canadian job as long as it's outside the province of Quebec. So I will talk about the program, the eligibility requirements, the process your employer has to go through, and I'll show you guys. So let's just start from here. So I have signed in now to, this is the employer portal. There's a lot of stuff on my channel about the employer portal. The employer portal is what a employer needs to do to submit an offer of employment to IRCC, okay? So I've said this before, I'll say it again. There are two ways to get a work permit in Canada, or they fall at least under two programs. One is the Temporary Foreign Worker Program that requires having a positive LMIA. The other program is the International Mobility Program, which offers all these LMIA exemptions. So these are work permits that can be issued under any of these programs. So public policies, international agreements, this is USMCA or CUSMA, Canada, Peru, Canada, Colombia. Now I want to go down to Francophone Mobility, which is C16, okay? So what is the Francophone Mobility Program? This is the wording from the operational guidelines, the manuals, the procedural instructions. So this is what an officer references essentially when doing your work permit, okay? So the minister has designated the category of work by foreign nationals and this was just updated last year, okay? So the Francophone Mobility Program became a heck of a lot easier with less restrictions and less requirements. So you only need to prove that you have a CLB5, okay, competence in speaking and listening, speaking proficiency. So basically verbal communication. You don't even need to write or be able to read French, okay? And the reason they have the Francophone Mobility Program is because they do want to encourage French speakers to immigrate outside Quebec to maintain Canada's identity as a bilingual nation, which arguably it is. I mean, there's something like 24% of the nation are French speakers, but it's mostly isolated to Quebec, Northern Ontario, Eastern Ontario, and Eastern Canada. So not so much in the West. So when you look at these requirements, what they've done is basically they've made it so that you can basically get a job offer in any occupation with the exception of primary agricultural occupations that are unskilled, tier 4 and 5. So they don't want farm hands being hired under the Francophone Mobility Program, which would kind of make sense why they would do that. They don't want to compete with the Temporary Foreign Worker Program of agricultural LMIAs, or potentially because they know that these people aren't necessarily going to be using French in their day-to-day when they are, pruning cherry trees or picking cherries in the Okanagan. So I would argue that that's probably why they brought that in. So, but other than that, there's something like 516 NOC codes. So there are many other ones, like maybe 495 or 500 that could qualify under Francophone Mobility. And when you look at the requirements, so they talk about the previous ones, okay? But now the new ones are, you're destined to live and work in a province or territory outside Quebec. So that means all of Canada's 9 other provinces or 3 territories. And you have an offer of employment, which is either a high-skilled occupation, tier 0, 1, 2, or 3, or low skilled 4 and 5. But it can't be in the primary agriculture section as defined in 315. So this is the definition of primary agriculture sector. So means work that's performed within the boundaries of a farm, nursery, or greenhouse and involves the operation of agricultural machinery. So if your work qualifies under any of these, then it would not count. But you see here they have the exclusions. So yeah, if you're a landscape architect, veterinary activities, or agronomist or agricultural economists, likely working at a university or a research institute, those are exceptions. Okay, so this, and for a lot of people, I'd say maybe 95% of occupations aren't in the primary agriculture sector. I don't know the specific number, but I would say this likely isn't going to be a prohibitory factor for a lot of people. Okay, so looking then, prove to an officer they meet the French language requirements, speaking and listening. Like I said, you only need to speak and listen, so it has to be verbal communication at an CLB or NCLC, which is the French translation of that, to level 5 or higher. So under TEF, you would take the test after. This is what you need to score, okay, in listening and speaking. A minimum of 352 and a minimum of 387 in speaking. And if you have that, we know that exam results are typically valid for 2 years. So if you haven't written a TEF, you should go ahead and write it. And then there's also TCF, which there's your listening, 369 is a minimum, and speaking a 6. So I don't have too much familiarity with the French language equivalencies, but I think for a lot of people who have a basic knowledge in French, or maybe even no knowledge, but your first language is a romantic language like Spanish or Italian, I'm pretty sure 3 months of intense studying, you could become a CLB5 in communication for French. Even if you were to, let's say, live in the province of Quebec for 3 months, you're on an open work permit, and you did some intense 10 to 12 hours a day of studying, you could become a CLB5. Now, this is interesting. The language of work does not need to be in French. It's not applicable in the province of Quebec. It's really to encourage French speakers to settle outside of Quebec. Okay, so what you need to do for your work permit application is an offer of employment number generated by the employer portal when the Canadian institutions submit the offer, or the exempt form 5802. 5802 is for when the employer is struggling with the employer portal, or for some reason they don't have a CRA business number. That likely is not the case if they're hiring you. So again, 95%, 98% of businesses should be able to create an employer portal through IRCC to submit this offer. Now, prove the work locations outside of Quebec. Well, I mean, if the company is incorporated in any of the other 9 provinces, that's pretty good proof, and your work location will be indicated on the offer of employment through the employer portal. For applications submitted after June 15th, as I mentioned, you need to show you have the ability to communicate, just speaking and listening, in CLB5. Okay, and they accept TEF or TCF results. Okay. Another proof could be a written confirmation from a college or university in a program completed in French. If you have studied in French, you likely can communicate at a CLB5 level. So for a lot of people, that may be an applicable source as well. I'd say still go ahead and write the TEF or TCF if you're confident in your abilities, because that is a standardized test, and the officer will have much less, I'd say, ability to refuse your application believing that you don't qualify for it. Okay, so I would say go ahead and get a TEF. It's a couple $100, just get it done. Or other documents to show education in French. I mean, I'm sure if they see that you did a bachelor's degree in France from a French university where the language of instruction is in French, they're going to believe that you can speak French. Especially if you come from like a French country where French is very prevalent. So Morocco, for example, or Belgium, they might believe that, okay, if you studied at a French university, you reach that CLB5 level. I still recommend submitting it with that exam. Don't give them any reason to refuse the application. Okay? So, yeah, officers can use their discretion to be satisfied that sufficient evidence has been provided that they meet a moderate French language level proficiency. So, they're saying that the officer may request further evidence of a language ability, for example, TEF or TCF. That's why I'm saying just don't leave anything up to interpretation. Go ahead and get that TEF and TCF. And then the final step would be an oral assessment if necessary, but I've never ever seen that happen besides at a port of entry application where, Francophone Mobility Program work permit, trying to get it approved at the border. Yes, if the CBSA officer speaks French, they're going to speak to you in French and make sure that you know how to understand French. So this is what the offer's putting in, ensure the exemption code matches the description and requirements. So they're going to make sure that, okay, C16, that's Francophone. Do they have their test results? Is it outside of primary agriculture? Is it for in tier 4 or 5? And is it for a job outside of Quebec? And they're going to then look at the other requirements. So is it reasonable employment need? Okay, so reasonable employment need, I use the example of a barber shop hiring an iron worker. That's, for example, they would refuse that because a barber shop does not require the NOC, the occupation code of an iron worker. So they're going to check on on that sort of thing. But for genuine jobs, that's really not a concern. If you're working at a retail store, they need a retail sales supervisor. There you go. Or they need a cashier. Clearly, that is a reasonable job. And can the employer afford to pay the wages based on the reported income? So they're going to be looking at right there. There's a section in the employer portal where you can put amount of revenue. Okay, so you're going to see that. And it's not nearly as stringent as an LMIA application. I do not know if IRCC does actually look into the CRA and what the business has reported. They may have the ability to do that. I'd imagine they probably can. If it's a very, very small company, they may have concerns. But for most people where you're being hired on a genuine job, then of course, if the employer can pay your wages and the employer is offering you that job, IRCC should think that that's reasonable as well. And this is where I see a lot of people get screwed up in it, is the employer will submit the offer and not consider it from the manual and the brains of an immigration officer. Okay, so they're going to be looking at, is there a variance in these job duties? If they say, yeah, they're a retail sales supervisor, and then or put in, let's say the NOC code is cashier, but then you're doing management and hiring duties for the company, that's a variance in duties. Wrong NOC code. It's an easy refusal for them, okay? So they also are going to look at, okay, has this person done 50 Francophone mobility applications and they have like 51 people on payroll? They're going to start to question the genuineness. And it's important that the contact information matches the name of the company. That's in the offer of employment through the employer portal, okay? So that's pretty much it. I've talked about it. So who qualifies? If you can prove that you can speak and listen in CLB5 capacity, NCLC, in the French language with a TEF or a TCF, you can be given an offer of employment and then apply for a work permit under the Francophone Mobility Program as long as it's for outside Quebec and it's not in primary agriculture and it's not unskilled in primary agriculture. Sorry, it's not unskilled in primary agriculture. And to know if it's in the primary agriculture, you can check that reference the act here, or the regulations, I should say. Okay, so that's it. And they can issue the work permit for 3 years. The offer of employment in the employer portal, they have the option here. Let's continue this session so I don't got to log back in again. Okay, So, oh, perfect. Didn't have to do the two-factor again. I'll show you guys now where they'll say how to apply. So this is, of course, then applying for the work permit. So you meet the general eligibility requirements for a work permit. I've talked about that extensively, how you can prove that, ties to home country, that you have the work experience to do the job. You want to show English or French, and French results, especially in this case, so you can communicate in the language for the position. And any other proofs that you can do the work and that you're eligible for a work permit. And you get your custom checklist here. I can go through that a little at the end of this video, but I do mostly want to focus on this is the employer portal. So I have an employer portal for SJP Immigration Inc., of course, my own company. Now, access the offer of employment queue. Why? Well, because I had another previous application for a demonstration that I was doing. So I'll delete this and I return to previous page, or I could have just clicked submit an offer of employment. So this is what your employer is going to have to do. They're going to have to go sign up for an employer portal account at employer portal IRCC. Okay. And I have a lot of videos on how to do this and how to enroll. I've done it so many times and done it for so many employers that I've realized it's not the most user-friendly process. So you're going to continue to GC key. Your employer is going to create their own GC key. Your employer probably has heard of GC key because it's linked to CRA and other things. But again, they're creating a GC key. They should create one for the company. They should create a username that's like the company name, like let's say McDonald's Tilsonburg, right? So that is what you'd want to do. Create the employer will create the username, create the GC key. And if there's any problems where they get logged out, kicked out, they have to refresh their cache and cookies, it kicks them back to the IRCC homepage, right? Which, not this one, but it kicks them to the IRCC homepage here. Okay, so then the employer goes in here and they're like, okay, what do I do? Oh, sign in. But now they're signing in with the GC key though, but under like a secure applicant portal, not the employer portal. So I always recommend, guys, just save this link as an employer and go back to this link. Keep going back to the employer portal link. Okay, if it's gonna kick you out to the IRCC homepage, you don't want to now link that GC key to like a foreign national profile as if you're trying to apply for a visitor visa or an IEC class work permit, because then it'll say you're not eligible to access this. And you'll have to revoke the GC key, start again. And once the employer portal is created, if let's say they already have an employer portal and then they go and try and create a second one on top of it with the same CRA business number, they won't be able to. They're going to have to email the employer portal help desk. All those questions are kind of answered in a very poor manner in the enrollment and the user guide. Okay. It's not a very user-friendly portal, but if your employer manages to create one and get in like I have, that is the first and most challenging step. Okay. Then once they're in here, they would go to submit an offer of employment, and they're going to put in all the business information. Of course, like I said, this has to match what their business is, because IRCC is going to get all this information. And you'd also want to encourage your employer to be able to screenshot all this information so you have this information, so you know what has been submitted, you know when your expected start date is, you know what the employer put for your main job duties, right? Because then when you're submitting your work permit application, you want to be able to reference it, and you want there to be consistencies between the two. So of course, business telephone number, that's going to be the telephone number to contact the business. They put in their business address here, okay? And sometimes a business address can be different than a mailing address. So business address is usually referred to what is registered with the CRA, where the corporate documents are held. So many times, maybe the business address could be the actual working location, and then they have a separate mailing address, like a PO box. Or if they're out in the country, maybe they'll also have a the business address is their home office. Like it's incorporated at home, but their mailing address is not their home, right? They use a mailbox or something like that. So the business address is not necessarily where you'll be working. It is where that company is registered. Okay. And for larger companies, it's usually like the headquarter or the primary principal first location for restaurants. Type of business, most of them are going to be incorporated. That means a corporation. Partnership is like a sole proprietor, but between two people. I think it can also be between three, maybe, but there's less limits of liability. Then you've got sole proprietor. Is the business a franchise? If it was, you would provide the name of the franchise head corporation. So this is what your employer is supposed to be doing. You need a web address, so they need to have a web address where the IRCC officer can go see what this business does, see if they're genuine and legitimate. So they would put in their web address here, the date the business started. This is likely on the certificate of incorporation. That's technically when the business started operations. Sometimes people incorporate and then they don't start operations for like a year later. So maybe they would want to use the date that they actually opened their doors for business. But either one, it's okay for either selection, in my opinion. You just justify the date the business started. That could be when it's incorporated, or it could be when you opened for business. Describe the principal business activity. This is you're telling this is the opportunity to tell the officer what type of business this company is engaged in. Okay. So if you want to be really lazy, you can use the NAICS code, North American Industry Classification. And let's do this for, let's actually say that we're doing this for a particular occupation. Let's say for a food service supervisor. So I would go to NAICS code restaurant. And let's say, and this is 2017. 722, well, that's American, but essentially it's like the NOC code, but for businesses. And full service restaurants are limited service eating places. So if it's just like a takeout joint, or maybe it's full service, let's say it's a McDonald's, it's full service, 722511, right? This is the 2017. I would recommend using the most recent 2021, but I don't believe there was any change to it, okay? And this is the description. The industry comprises establishments primarily engaged in providing food services to patrons who order or while seated and pay while eating, or who order, right? That's basically the description of a restaurant. So that's what the employer could put there if they just wanted to copy and paste. Or they could, founded in 2018, we started serving up burgers. We're part of the franchise, the head franchise, this. Describe the principal activity. Usually 2-3 sentences are fine. Number of employees, okay, under 100 employees, that would be the employees that are under the actual payroll number of that business. Obviously, the McDonald's head corporation has more than 100 employees, but this is the employer portal account for that specific branch or location. Gross revenue, so this is what they're going to use to determine if they can afford to hire you. So startup visas and C11 entrepreneurs that are getting started in Canada, they usually put less than 30,000, especially if they just launched or they just started their company. Most companies are probably going to be small companies are going to be between the 30,000 and 5 million range. And some companies may even be, and many large companies are going to be over 5 million. Okay. User contact. This is the primary contact who will be contacted by IRCC for further information. So it should be the person who is filling out the employer portal, likely HR manager or owner or HR director or hiring manager, right? They're going to put this in and that's it. They complete that. Now, foreign worker, they are going to need to have your last names and first names, and it should be exactly as it's represented in your passport. So because this offer of employment, they're going to cross-reference with your work permit, okay? So last names, sometimes people have two last names. Those will go there. First names also refers to given names. last name is surname. If you have a middle name, I would put it in first names because it's a given name, at least for me, right? So gender, you're going to put that in there. That's representative on your passport, your date of birth, country of birth. Now your employer has to do this. So you have to trust that your employer is getting this information correctly. So usually I just recommend sending the bio data page of your passport to your employer because they've got to put your passport number in here as well, your citizenship. For your country of residence, if you're living in Canada, they should put Canada. If you're overseas, they're going to put wherever you're living overseas. And then your country of birth, well, that's determined from your passport, okay? And I'm just curious if they do have the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, so they do have countries that no longer exist, right? Because you might have been born in former USSR, which is now like modern day Russia or Kazakhstan. So job details. This is also where employers can kind of screw this thing up. So let's go in and check out, where is our C16? There's our Francophone Mobility Program. Okay. I also talked to a lot of people about doing the rural and northern immigration pilot, so I can do a video on that later. So it's good to see that it's there. But they would do Francophone Mobility. It auto-populates this exemption code. Please explain in your own words how you meet the requirements of the LMIA exemption. Make sure to provide as much detail as possible. Well, what are the eligibility requirements for the exemption? They are right here. So the work is outside Quebec. Like literally the exemption, it's not that challenging. The work is outside Quebec in the remaining provinces of Canada, wherever. The work is outside Quebec. The applicant speaks and listens at least a CLB 5 proficiency. The job is not in the primary agricultural sector. Probably spelled that wrong, but I'm just trying to get through for illustrative purposes, okay? Those are the requirements. The work is outside Quebec, the applicant speaks and listens at CLB 5, and the job is not in the primary agricultural sector. That's it. This, live and work, listening skills, and it's not in the primary agricultural sector. Done. Done, done, done. Job title. This would be, let's go, food service supervisor. Not code. That would be in the 6.3 or 6.2, I think. Yeah, 62020. Food service supervisor. Provide the address of the primary physical job location. So now you see this is kind of what's going to be coded on your work permit. Maybe not the exact address and everything, but this would be where you're going to be working. What particular location? A lot of people ask, yeah, well, you can put another location. Okay, great. You're allowed to provide a secondary job location. So maybe you work at 2 different McDonald's locations in Tillsonburg, Ontario, let's say. Expected duration of employment. This is a text field. So I usually put 3 years or at least 3 years. That will give you a potential 3-year work permit, especially if it's in a skilled occupation. They're more likely to give a 3-year work permit, but this is what the employer is putting. They could put permanent, indeterminate, but I do recommend at least, saying 2 or 3 years, but it does depend on the job. It might only be for 1 year, okay? So it's your employer's discretion what they want to put here, but I usually put 3 years because that's the max work permit they're going to issue is 3 years. Main duties of the job. Okay, so for food service supervisor, it might have a special thing. Like you're encouraged at McDonald's to follow our, franchise guidelines and support our customers and our clients. And they're part of the McDonald's family, like a word salad of welcome to working at McDonald's. The main duties should be, I don't want to say cut and paste from the knock, but they should be 80% close to the knock. So this is pretty much it. Supervise, coordinate, schedule the activity of staff. So pretty much like this. These are the main duties of a food service supervisor. There might be some slightly different ones for McDonald's or different wording, like working at the drive-through window or assisting customers with the self-ordering screens, for example, replacing the paper in those self-order screens. So the job duties may vary slightly, and this is patients in hospital or other customers. So obviously the term hospitals may not likely be on the job duties for McDonald's unless the McDonald's is in a hospital, which would be actually not a bad place for a McDonald's. So you could have, these are the duties, and you can modify these, or your employer should modify them to really match what you're doing. And so if the employer gives you the job duties and you want to make sure that they're, they sound a bit more like cashier and less like food service supervisor, that could become problematic because maybe it's the wrong NOC code, right? It's unskilled versus skilled. So, I mean, it would still be approved in Francophone, but you would just have to select the right NOC code in the employer portal. You'd have to go down to cashier, not food service supervisor. So you want to make sure that your job duties, your real job duties, best represent the NOC code, which you're applying under. And one great way to check is if you copy the job duties from the employer, you paste them into ChatGPT and ask ChatGPT, what NOC does this sound like? Give me the top 3 NOCs. And if the first NOC is food service supervisor, you're on the right track. Okay? That's a large language model. It's using information and data from so many different sources. So if it's telling you that the best one is food service supervisor, that's a pretty good shot that the job duties are correct. Minimum education requirements for the job. These shouldn't be different, significantly different than the NOC code. Okay. So the employment requirements here are secondary schools usually required, but you don't actually need to, as a food service supervisor, complete secondary school. Completion in food service, hotel and restaurant are required. Okay. Or related discipline or several years of experience. So you either need experience or you need education because it says are required. So that's on your work permit side now. If you have a bachelor in hospitality or diploma in hospitality, that's what you can use. If you don't have any of that education, you're just high school, then you want to show that you've worked like 3 years in food service, right? You started as a server or a cashier or bartender, and now you've upgraded to food service supervisor. These are what the employers or the IRCC officers going to be looking at and matching with your profile on your work permit. Okay. Back to other, minimum education requirements. So I would say for a food service supervisor, it could be something like, it's not a trade diploma, it's not apprentice. It could be college level diploma certificate. I wouldn't recommend employers putting that unless you're going to include your college level diploma certificate in food service on your work permit application. If you don't, it could just be secondary schools, the minimum. And they could also say other training required. You could just say like, not copy and paste from the NOC, but literally say several years experience in food service is required, right? If that person they're hiring has that experience and can show that experience. Okay. So but I'd say minimum education could be secondary school, but it says is usually required. It's not mandated. Okay. So some people do actually could drop out of high school, work for 5 years in restaurant, and be totally qualified to work as a food service supervisor. Just make sure that your employer is not putting anything here that's outrageous. Like, I want a doctor of medicine to work as a food service supervisor. Okay. And then for unskilled jobs, it's going to be more no formal education requirement, right? Experience and skills required to complete the job duties. This is where they can put in 2 to 3 years experience in food service and hospitality, verifiable experience in food service and hospitality in the same sector, or like a year or 2 of customer service experience and any other requirements that the employer wants to see before hiring you. This, for food service supervisor, it is no, but sometimes there are registration requirements. Let's say you're doing an LMIA exempt Francophone mobility as a nurse. Yeah, to practice as a nurse, you need to be licensed by the Alberta College of Nurses or the BC College of Nurses and Midwives if you're in British Columbia. So you would want to put the certifying license body, even if you want to be hired as an immigration consultant. So that would be for an immigration consultant, and you can find immigration consultant there actually as a knock for it. I think it starts with 4. So are there employer compliance fees? Yes, there are. There are some exemptions for employer compliance fees for Francophone Mobility Program. I'm not going to go into that because they do not qualify. Okay, so the employer is going to have to pay the $230. This is the primary contact who will be contacted by IRCC for further information. We already kind of put this in at the first section. Again, it makes sense to be the HR or the owner or the person who's actually filling this out. You can do the same person as you put in business information. I've done that and never had any issues. Wages and benefits. This is where the company's going to be paying you directly. No would be like, let's say you were getting hired through a staffing company, or if you were getting paid strictly on commissions, or you had an alternate compensation scheme with bonuses and paid by piecework. So for the most people, for a real full-time job, this is going to be yes. Type of wage, Canadian dollars per hour or per year. You could put in a salary, but likely for food service supervisor, it's going to be, let's say $17.50 per hour, work hours per day, 8, number of work hours per week, 40, right? Work hours per month. This would be 173.33 if you assume 4.3 weeks in a month. Overtime rate, yeah, you would have an overtime rate. It's 1.5 times this wage. So I don't know exactly what that would be right now. Let's just say 30, probably 28, something like that. My math is slow this morning, maybe 25. Overtime starts, how many hours per week? This should be 44. At least I think that's what it is for Ontario. Additional information, additional alternate compensation scheme. This would be any more information the employer wants to let IRCC know, like maybe if you're eligible for a bonus or any other wage considerations. But I don't think a lot of people will have that. That won't be really necessary, but that's where you would put that in. If, okay, we couldn't fit it into one of these boxes, but they are going to be getting tips, right? McDonald's doesn't allow tips. Anybody would be like cash tips or that sort of thing that vary. They might want to put that in under additional information. Like, this is a service-based role. They may receive tips from customers. Benefits. This is your employer's going to know if they're offering disability, dental, pension, or extended, okay? Type of vacation. Usually employers just go with remuneration. 4%, I believe, is the minimum. And then they can put in additional information or other benefits. This is where you can put in other benefits like, free parking or discounted food, right? Discounts for employees. Those are benefits. And you could specify more. You could say like a 50% discount or whatever it is for McDonald's. I'm sad that I never actually worked at McDonald's. Days of vacation, 10. Maybe it's 10 or maybe it's 15 in Ontario, but usually it's a minimum of, I think, 2 weeks. In Alberta, it's probably 2 or 3 in Ontario, but remuneration is just, they're likely just going to give you 4% vacation pay. Okay? And that's it. This likely won't validate. And actually it did. So, I did put in all the information that was required. So once all these are complete, then your employer will click submit. They will be given an option to upload how they meet the LMIA exemption requirements. I don't think it's your employer's job to include any supporting documentation. That should be your job as the applicant to put that into your work permit application. Show how you show that you speak the CLB5, right? Your employer is not an immigration consultant. Your employer is not an immigration lawyer. Your employer is in the business of fast food or any other business. So I wouldn't expect them to know that and have to put that supporting documentation. I've never put supporting documentation in for any LMIA exemption, even for complicated C10 and C11s, because I just put it all on the work permit application. Gives the applicant more control. They're not relying on their employer to say what exemption they're applying under, okay? Because it's not really expected that employers would know so much about the exemptions and the immigration rules for Canada. Once they submit, they're going to get a Moneris page to make a $230 payment for the employer compliance fee. Once that payment is received, I recommend you indicate to your employer, please, please, please take a screenshot of that to show that payment has been made, okay? So that the two documents you're asking for your employer, you want two things you want from your, maybe they actually are down now. So the two things you want from your employer are the offer of employment number, which your employer is going to get via email within 5 minutes. Okay. I had the case of somebody asking me once, the employer didn't receive that email. I'm pretty sure they must have, or they put in the wrong email. Maybe they incorrectly entered their email address and they never received the email, but they were able to pull out their offer of employment number, right, by going in and accessing the offer of employment queue. So once you submit it, you'll see it here. You click access the submitted offers of employment, you search all offers, it'll show up here. You'll see the offer of employment number, foreign worker name, date created, and there's your A number, okay, that you can put on your LMIA exempt work permit application. When you do that work permit application, whether it's from outside the country, you're using 1295 IMM. If you're inside the country, you're using 5710, extent changing your conditions. There's a drop down. What type of work permit are you applying for? Open, closed, vulnerable, startup, business class. You're going to put LMIA exemption, and then a field's going to open up, and that's where you put in this A number. Okay, so you've received it by email, or your employer's received it by email, and you ask your employer to either send you that email or send you a PDF of that email so you have the A number. Then secondly, you ask your employer that when they make that $230 payment, they capture that payment confirmation receipt. Because if they don't, it can create problems sometimes if they're not sure the employer has paid or if they're trying to track down the offer of employment in their system. And their employer portal has not been issuing actual receipts for some time, which is why you have to take a picture of the Moneris window. And I recommend that all the time because that's in the work permit guidelines. When they're looking through how to evaluate your work permit, they're going to make sure that proof of payment was made. So why not just show it? It doesn't have any of the credit card details for your employer anyways. It's basically a receipt. So that is what you would do. Then once you get that number, you're good to go. And when you look at the requirements, so quickly I'll just go into Francophone mobility. Let's say let's get that checklist. It would be under, okay. So there's your 5710. You're going to complete that and you're doing it as LMIA exemption, and you're putting in, it's also going to ask you your intended location of employment. That was likely the primary business location your employer put through the employer portal, right? So that's why it's nice if your employer can give you all the information that they have submitted through the employer portal, right? The data. Use of rep, that's only if you're using a representative like me. This, for a lot of people, won't apply. It's releasing information to somebody else. And statutory declaration of common law union, that's, of course, if you're in a common law relationship. Proof of payment, that's automatically going to happen when you submit through the GC key. Photocopies of the passport page showing, passport number, basically the bio data page, any stamps, any Canadian visas, Any valid visas I would include in your client information. Talked a lot about that. And photocopy of your current immigration document, because yeah, you are applying from within Canada. You have to have a current immigration document, maybe your work permit, your study permit, your visitor record, okay? And photocopy of your marriage license or certificate, if applicable, if you are married. And this is now talking about if you're the dependent of another applicant, okay? So this is also for like an open work permit for spouses. This is what we're concerned about. You do not have an LMIA. If your employer is exempt from maintaining an LMIA, which is Francophone Mobility, your employer must provide you with an offer of employment number for inclusion in your work permit application form. So that's all you need. If they authorized it to submit using the 5802, so which means they couldn't use the employer portal, they couldn't submit the offer to the employer portal, you need to provide a copy of that form, 5802, and proof the employer compliance fee has been paid. And then only if your employer is exempt from the employer compliance regime, which means they don't pay the $230, which you can read about this exemption. Many aren't going to fall under it. But if they don't have to pay that $230, they have to provide a copy of the employment contract. For an LMIA exempt, Francophone Mobility, the employment offer is what the employer submits through the employer portal. Okay? So you actually don't need to submit an additional written job offer. In fact, I wouldn't even recommend going and getting that if you don't need to. If the employer's putting it in through the IRCC employer portal, they're going to see all those details anyways. If they want to also give you a written offer, fine. I would attach that to your work permit application, but it's not required. Medical exams, Quebec, and here we go. The big one is proof indicating you meet the requirements of the job being offered, including LMIA exemption requirements. So that means your TEF and TCF, those results, put that into your client information, or if you're given that header, you can put that into the proof of exemption, meeting the job. And they say here the requirements may be proof of education, work experience. So if you're currently already working for that employer, they would put that in like a reference letter. And don't get caught up in relationship between the Canadian and foreign entity businesses. That's for intercompany transferee. Proof of reciprocity. That's another LMIA exemption. And proof your work creates significant economic benefits. That's for C10, C11, A77. So this is where you want to put in, if you've done an IELTS, if you've done, definitely you have to put in your TEF or TCF or other French proof, like I said at the beginning, and other requirements you meet the job. If it's a nurse, you want to show that you have, you're licensed with the appropriate college in the province that you're proposed to be working for, right? So that's pretty much it about that's how an employer can submit an offer through the employer portal. That's talking about the Francophone Mobility Program. I've done substantial videos on basically how to do the employer portal now. I've talked a lot about work permits and closed work permit applications. I'd like to do that at a later date, just a generic closed work permit application regardless of the job, but one that is like regardless of the exemption. So for Francophone, for Canada-Colombia Free Trade Agreement, also for any of the other free trade agreements or RNIP, for example, you have to establish your eligibility for the exemption, and then you have to establish your eligibility for the work. And the one thing that's consistent amongst all the applications is establishing your eligibility for the work, and how you go and evaluate that within the NOC code, find out that you meet the requirements, and what you can use to prove that to the officer that you're capable to perform the work sought in Canada. So I hope that was helpful for Francophone Mobility, and I hope more people take advantage of this program. It's a heck of a lot easier than doing an LMIA. It's 5 minutes, 5 minutes to basically get the offer approved, not 5 months like an LMIA process. It's a heck of a lot easier. It helps to strengthen Francophone communities. If, French speakers are being brought outside of Quebec, it's a great way to extend your work permit. It's a great way to get onto a work permit. It's a great way to hire a foreign worker if you need to. It's a great way to get basically single day processing, get the offer of employment approved, then you're ready to apply for the work permit. You're not waiting 5 to 6 months for an LMIA right through Service Canada. It's a lot cheaper for the employer. It's $230, not $1,000 plus ridiculous consulting fees to get an LMIA approved. So I would highly recommend that people take advantage and look into the Francophone Mobility Program. And this video is probably very useful for employers, mostly for the offer of employment submission part. And yeah, thanks for tuning in. Thank you for subscribing. Let me know what else you want to see, and have a great day.